Let's just dive right into this. Today, we're doing a forensic deep dive in this explainer, essentially unpacking the tenure of a highly celebrated civil servant to reveal the heavily documented yet rarely discussed reality of what actually happened under his administrative watch. We are looking at an incredible source document from the Death Certificate Project, and it takes a hard look at the administrative accountability of one man, Sarabjit Singh. He was an Indian Administrative Service Officer who served as the Deputy Commissioner, or DC, and District Magistrate of Amritsar from July 1987 to May 1992. What this source material does is present a staggering contrast. On one side, you have a highly curated, celebrated public legacy. On the other, you have what's known as the Second Ledger, a deeply documented record of systemic, horrific human rights violations that occurred entirely on his watch. We're going to explore how an entire administrative machinery actually functioned during a period of intense counterinsurgency, or perhaps more accurately, how it was intentionally engineered to fail the very people it was supposed to protect. So, we're going to treat this exactly like an investigative audit. We'll start by looking at the celebrated official himself, then map out the middle corridor timeline. After that, we'll follow the paper trail of his signatures, look at the harrowing reality of what happened when desperate families literally knocked on his door, examine the anatomy of his administrative silence, and finally, open up that dark second ledger. Section 1. Let's talk about the celebrated official and the public legacy of Sarabjit Singh. Now, by all public accounts, Sarabjit Singh was a profoundly decorated IAS officer. We're talking about a man who won a Padma Shri, which is the Republic of India's absolute highest civilian honor. After he retired, he went on to head a prestigious cultural institution. He even wrote a highly acclaimed memoir in 2002 subtitled An Eyewitness Account of Terrorism in Punjab. It paints the picture of a hero, but here is what is so utterly fascinating and frankly disturbing. His entire public legacy and that celebrated book of his are defined by just 9 days. Exactly 9 days of a hostage negotiation at the Golden Temple complex in May 1988. During this brief window known as Operation Black Thunder, he stood at the entrance appealing for peaceful surrender. He was the face of state restraint. And those 9 days, they became the absolute foundation of his historical footprint. They became the best-selling book. They became the official, sanitized memory of his entire time in Amritsar. But here's the catch. His actual tenure as Deputy Commissioner lasted 1,768 days. Just think about that massive, gaping hole in the timeline for a second. You have a book written about 9 days of administrative success, but absolute total silence on the remaining 1,759 days. That is nearly 5 years of jurisdiction where mass atrocities were occurring simultaneously right under his nose. Not a single page of his memoir mentions the desperate families who petitioned his office daily. Not a word about the young men who disappeared into illegal police custody. Total silence on the thousands of bodies being secretly cremated in his own district. The documentation we are examining today fills in those 1,759 missing days, shifting our focus away from the state-sanctioned PR narrative and diving straight to the terrifying human rights ledger. Moving to Section 2, the middle corridor timeline. This is where we break down the triad of silence that governed Amritsar during this dark era. To really understand the colossal failure of accountability here, you have to realize how Amritsar was governed at the time. It was under direct central administration, what's called governor's rule. There was no elected local government, no local politicians to act as a buffer for the citizens. Because of this, the deputy commissioner was the absolute supreme civil executive. He had all the power. The source document breaks this era down into a triad of 3 administrators. First, you had Ramesh Indra Singh, who oversaw the initial post-1984 period. Then, Sarabjit Singh took over in July 1987. He stepped into what we call the middle corridor, arriving right at the absolute peak of district-wide violence. Finally, he was succeeded by KBS Sidhu in May 1992. Now, because of his placement in this timeline, Sarabjit Singh was not just some passive bystander. He was the highest civilian conscience of the district at the exact moment this system of violence was operating at its most ruthless capacity. And the realities documented by human rights groups under his command structure are genuinely horrifying. We are talking about state-sponsored vigilante groups, often referred to as the Alam Sena or Black Cats, operating under Senior Superintendent of Police Ishar Alam. These groups were actively targeting Sikhs across the district. They were liquidating families, burning homes, and essentially being used as a government tool to spread absolute mistrust and terror among anyone who even had sympathy for the Sikh struggle. The dossiers from this time are full full of agonizing accounts. They detail systemic sexual violence and horrific assaults against minority women in police custody. Look at the incredibly well-documented case of Anok Singh Babar. He was brutally tortured to death at the Virawal police station in August 1987. Keep in mind, this happened within Sarabjit Singh's first 2 months in office. By law, a custodial death of this magnitude required mandatory reporting and an independent magisterial inquiry. But what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a single public record or inquiry was ever produced by the DC's office. Section 3. The Signature Trail. Let's look at how the law itself was weaponized. Now, it's a really common defense for civil servants of this era to just shrug and say, well, we were kept in the dark by the police. We didn't know. But constitutional court records completely destroy that defense. As the district magistrate, Sarabjit Singh held sweeping, immense powers under the National Security Act, or NSA, and the Tada Act to issue preventive detentions. He wasn't out of the loop, he was the one holding the pen. This exact mechanical phrase, "I am satisfied," appeared repeatedly on hundreds of detention orders. The law explicitly required him to evaluate evidence and be genuinely satisfied that a person's detention was strictly necessary for public order. Instead, the evidence reveals he operated as a deliberate rubber stamp. No other DC of his era signed NSA and Tada orders with such uncritical frequency. His office actively participated in the detention architecture, taking illegal police requests and instantly converting them into executive detention, with zero independent legal evaluation. You don't just have to take my word for it. Look at the specific interventions made by constitutional courts. In the documented cases of Kulwant Singh, Lakhwinder Singh, and Sohan Singh, the Punjab and Haryana High Court literally threw out the detention orders signed by Sarabjit Singh. And you know why? Because these detainees were already sitting in judicial custody on other charges. They were already locked up. The courts found that his office was routinely and illegally using the NSA simply to prevent people from getting bail. It was a tool to lock people up indefinitely. If 3 of these specific, blatant orders made it all the way to the High Court to be quashed, the archive forces us to ask a chilling question. How many thousands more were never challenged simply because the detainee was permanently disappeared before they could even reach a lawyer? Which brings us to Section 4, when families came knocking. These are known as the notice cases. I think the most damning evidence against him isn't just the paperwork, it's the physical human presence. Incredible field documentation by Human Rights Watch and Asia Watch places the desperate families of disappeared persons directly inside the Deputy Commissioner's office. Put yourself in the shoes of Daljit Singh's family for a moment. Daljit is arrested, unacknowledged by the police, in June 1999. You panic. You immediately send urgent telegrams to the DC and the governor. When that doesn't work, you show up in person. And you don't just show up once. You show up over 20 times. You sit directly across the desk from Deputy Commissioner Sarabjit Singh, the SSP, and the Inspector General. You look them in the eye. You beg for your young one. You get empty verbal assurances from the DC, while the police maintain a formal denial that they even have him. After all of this direct, face-to-face pleading with the absolute highest levels of district administration, you hit a bureaucratic dead end. No relief, no action. Daljit was extrajudicially executed months later, and his body was never returned to his family. The DC knew. The family told him. And the tragic thing is, sometimes the bureaucracy actually did formally acknowledge the petitions. In the case of Jatinder Singh, the DC explicitly noted receiving the desperate petition and even claimed to have spoken to the SSP about it. Yet, Jatinder permanently disappeared. In the case of Sukhwinder Singh, the DC actually went as far as ordering an internal inquiry, but it was immediately neutralized and ignored by the police hierarchy. So what we see here is that families were just being managed. The paperwork was filed away into a void, but the actual statutory power to save these young men, it was deliberately never used. Section 5. Let's look closely at the anatomy of administrative silence, and specifically, the massive legal tools that were deliberately left unused. You really have to ask, why was this state-sponsored violence so absolute? Why was there no check on it? Because the deputy commissioner wasn't just a paper pusher. They were the district magistrate, endowed with massive, almost unchecked judicial authority. Take Section 97 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, for example. This is arguably the most powerful tool in their entire legal arsenal. It's a legally mandated search warrant that allows a magistrate to literally walk into a police station, inspect the premises, and physically locate a wrongfully confined person. During Sarabjit Singh's tenure, with hundreds of documented cases of illegal custody happening all around him, and families like Daljit's literally crying in his office, there is not a single public record of a Section 97 search warrant ever being issued by him. not once. And the willful ignorance goes deeper. When a person dies in police custody, Section 1711 it mandates, the district magistrate to conduct an independent magisterial inquiry. For the hundreds upon hundreds of documented extrajudicial killings that occurred in his district, there are zero public records of these independent inquiries ever happening. But it wasn't just the high-level legal paperwork that vanished. It was the physical logistics of atrocity. Think about this. The district oversaw municipal bodies that were actively buying massive amounts of firewood with public taxpayer funds. Why? To cremate hundreds of unidentified bodies in secret. The entire administrative footprint that basic accountability requires, from mandatory police arrest reports all the way down to municipal firewood vouchers, was meticulously and intentionally ignored by the civil executive. Which brings us to our final section, the second ledger. Let's look at the staggering statistical architecture of this atrocity. When we dive into the primary source data collected by NSOF, which relies heavily on direct interviews with surviving families, a truly terrifying statistical picture emerges. Almost 40%, let that sink in, nearly 2/5 of all documented extrajudicial executions in the entire state of Punjab from 1984 to 1996 were concentrated almost exclusively in the Amritsar district while it was under his command. The data reveals an unbroken, steep escalation in killings from 1987 to 1992. That is the exact span of his middle corridor tenure. In fact, after Sarabjit Singh finally left office, the operational methodology of fake encounters, which had been perfectly refined and shielded by administrative silence in his district, was essentially exported and dispersed statewide. The machinery of death reached its documented operational peak right under his supervision. 2,097. 2,097. That is the confirmed, documented number of illegal cremations at just 3 specific sites in Amritsar, Patti, Tarn, and the Durgiana Mandir, as later investigated and confirmed by the Central Bureau of Investigation. Now, I want you to really think about the logistics of this. To cremate over 2,000 human bodies isn't a shadowy, secret operation that a few rogue cops can pull off in the dark. It requires an industrial level of logistics. It requires police vouchers for transport trucks, massive coordination with municipal records, and enormous amounts of firewood purchased continuously with public money. The deputy commissioner had absolute supervisory authority over all of these municipal systems. Yet for 1,768 days, this massive, horrific throughput of human remains operated in plain sight without triggering a single independent administrative audit from his office. It's staggering. So, we have to end on this profoundly unsettling question. When a decorated leader writes a celebrated book about 9 days of glory, but leaves thousands of dead unacknowledged over 4 years, which ledger truly defines their legacy? The district magistrate possessed every statutory tool needed to halt these abuses. He was directly notified by desperate families knocking on his door. He knew about the Elam Sena. He knew about the extrajudicial killings and custodial torture. And yet he deliberately chose administrative silence. If the hidden files, the unwritten inquiry reports, and the missing firewood vouchers were laid bare today, would they support the glowing narrative of the Padma Shri awardee? Or would they confirm a horrifying second ledger, a civil administration that actively managed and processed mass atrocities without a shred of resistance, leaving thousands of families permanently waiting for sons who would never return? That is the terrifying question this archive demands we ask. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. We'll see you next time.